Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. So Steve pulls it all together at the last moment. We go live and behind the curtain. We now launch and we just did it, right?
Okay.
Good.
Okay, so we're working.
Yeah. Well, I want to welcome everybody to the inaugural podcast series with Steve Keen. And he's quite a remarkable person and a very interesting contrarian economist, so to speak. And we'll talk about what a contrarian is and what a contrarian should be. And that it brings me to my first question for Steve. And how would you describe what a contrarian is?
Somebody who isn't deluded by mainstream economics, fundamentally. I mean, I know plenty of. I can actually say some of my best friends are mainstream economists. And I can name one of them, Michael Kumhoff, who's chief economist for the Bank of England, and a delightful bloke, and he's literally one of my best friends. But they have all learnt an approach to economics which began back in the 1870s, which was originated by Leon Walras in France, Stanley Jevons in the UK, and Menger, I can't think of Menger's first name, Karl Menger in Austria. And out of that sprung both neoclassical economics and Austrian economics. And they were all as reactions to Marx, fundamentally, in the sense that before they came along, the approach they took to economics was the minority approach. The majority was derived out of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and ultimately Marx. And that was one that saw value as being effort. So that what they called value was the effort involved in making something. It wasn't the satisfaction one got from that thing, subjective utility. Mm-hmm. Whereas the neoclassicals base their entire analysis on the idea that what we get out of life is subjective utility, and capitalism is a way of maximizing that subject to constraints. Mm-hmm. And that was, if you look at its origins, You can accept it in the 1870s as a reasonably decent initial foundation from which to start building economics. Nothing appeared fundamentally wrong with it. But because you start off with an unmeasurable quantity of subjective utility, and because your utility and my utility can't be compared, and maybe you get, as a billionaire, you might get a lot more satisfaction out of the next dollar than I get out of an extra dollar as a pauper, it meant all the interpersonal stuff became ludicrously complicated. And yet they tried to model the economy at the aggregate level. So what you got out of it was an enormous amount of nonsense, because before that, discoveries were made about what the consequences were of trying to put that in a mathematical framework. People would, I'm thinking now of Alfred Marshall, would draw nice little diagrams of intersecting lines saying, here's supply, here's demand, here's when they meet. The two scissors of the blade, demand and supply together set price and quantity, et cetera, et cetera. And that became mainstream economics. But in fact, when you try to go backwards from that initial vision and then try to give it mathematically sound grounding in the idea of utility maximizing individuals and profit maximizing firms, it falls over. The mathematics doesn't work. I'll give you the first major example of that, and that was Leon Walras, who modeled his model of a multi-commodity exchange system on the Paris Bourse. And in the Paris Bourse, I've actually walked past it. I've never actually been inside the building, but there would be a market for gold, a market for pigs, a market for flowers, and so on. And in every market, there was an auctioneer. And the auctioneer would declare an opening price and then tally up the bids, the buy and sell bids at that opening price. And if there are more buyers than sellers, then he'd increase the price, and vice versa, until there was a balance between supply and demand in that individual market. And then at that would be the price declared for that day, and that was the traded price, and the same thing would repeat in every market. And what Walras Sorry.
Let me just jump in because
I get into bloody lecture mode, as you can tell.
No, but it's really good. I mean, even in that last image, we have to think about, kind of what's going on with the barter system. And you start to talk about this earlier in your books about the neoclassical model is really based off of a barter system. I think that's what you're setting up, right? That's what you're
fundamentally, it's saying that here's a way of having multi-commodity barter. And that's a very good point, because again, one of my best friends was David Graeber, and David was the anthropologist who did the best work to popularize the knowledge that barter has never really existed. Whenever you look to try to find a barter system in pre-capitalist societies, you don't find one. You find barter, when it exists, is a stylized and ritualized way that tribes that are almost at war with each other manage to have some form of exchange and some form of social intercourse to stop, to prevent war breaking out. That's fundamentally when you find examples of barter at any systemic level. I've got to have a drink here, but on the thirsty side.
Okay, so Steve, help me with this concept here. I've just imagined the way you've described that the classical way of thinking of an economy has been more like the bubbling up of something akin to an imagined, like a religion of sorts, or
it's all been imagined. Yeah, that's true. I mean, one of the most dangerous things on the planet is the imagination of an economist. You talk about the armchair theorizer, and the classic armchair theorizer wasn't Adam Smith. It was actually a guy called Jeremy Bentham. Okay. And Bentham was far more responsible for neoclassical economics than Adam Smith was. But Bentham would actually, at one stage, sat down in his armchair and worked out a level of punishment for a whole range of crimes that he thought just managed to make the crime unattractive. And he was putting forward a set of laws where, if you spent 3 years in jail for stealing a loaf of bread, that was enough to discourage you from buying a loaf of bread. That's obviously neither an example nor an accurate one. It's a massive exaggeration. But he literally did that. Sitting in an armchair, he thought he could work out what punishments would deter which crimes. No, I'm sorry, that's not the real world. That's a fantasy. And the trouble is that when you make a fantasy intricate enough, like the Game of Thrones or the Tolkien, et cetera, people can believe it's real. and fundamentally, economists have a mathematical fantasy system they call economics. But when you dive into it, you find it is all fantasy. And unlike the Game of Thrones, where the writers can do what they damn well like, unfortunately, at various times, when you put things into a mathematical framework, if the maths doesn't fit these fantasy, it'll tell you. And this is one reason I'm a mathematical critic of mainstream economics, because looking at the mathematics, it has universally contradicted what the neoclassicals wish to believe. So what happens is they wave their hands very quickly, and it's a bit like watching a magic act where you're trying to see whether under which tin is the coin. It's all deception. But they're very good at deceiving themselves as well. So most of them believe it, and they'll be bloody angry that I'm describing this way. And I couldn't give a shit, because I've got sick and tired of the damage they've done to this society, this planet over the last 50 years, and it's time we got rid of them.
Yeah, I love in your books you talk about Copernicus and you talk about Max Planck as well. And it's a little bit of serendipitous, sort of coming together here between planksip and yourself, because Max Planck was the incipient namesake for planksip, right? It's like this same sort of basis when I actually thought of the branding and the name.
Oh yeah, I noticed. Yeah.
So there's lots of really interesting, kinds of commonalities, and I'll tell you where I hope to take this series is that you just mentioned somebody like Jeremy Bentham. In terms of, I think we could maybe summarize it as somebody that really didn't have his head in the clouds, or was really thinking about a philosophy of practicality, so to speak. And you're saying that the danger lies with the economists that start to imagine things, right?
Well, and Bentham was guilty of the same sort of stuff that neoclassicals do today. But before one could say there's mathematical errors, in the logical framework you're putting forward, Jeremy. So please drop that idea, pick up your head and go somewhere else. That's a reference to anybody who knows where Jeremy Bentham's body is not buried. It's at King's College. Is it King's College? It's King's College. When the head was stolen by students in the London School of Economics, I think it was LSE, who stole it sometime in the 19th century. But yeah, it is one of these things which is, it's a very intricate system, which at every crucial point in its structure is mathematically flawed. And the response of neoclassicals to it has been to hide the flaws because, and I can speak from having the experience of being somebody who believed this stuff when I was at school for 6 months in my first year at university as well. It's a very seductive anarchist vision of a perfect society. Because what it tells you is, here's a world where you don't need a government. In fact, government makes things worse. So the best thing is to minimize government, where there's no concentrations of power except for monopolies and trade unions. And let's abolish them both. But hey, it's hard to get rid of monopolies, so just abolish trade unions. That'll make things better. And you have a dispersal of power and the vision of perfect competition, which is supposed to mean that nobody makes a supernormal profit, and what things sell for, the marginal cost of something is equivalent to the marginal benefit. And what that people don't often wonder what the hell is marginal, this marginal, that means. When marginal is the rate of change of something. So marginal cost is the rate of change of cost, and they presume that marginal cost rises, which means if you drew the total cost curve, it gets steeper. And then marginal benefit is something which diminishes over time. So the more bananas you eat, the less utility you get out of the next banana. So what you get out of that is total utility rises but at a diminishing rate. And the gap between the two is at the highest level when the slopes are the same. So by saying when marginal cost equals marginal benefit, what they're saying is the gap between the cost of procuring something and the benefit you get from that is maximized. And that's the maximization of utility subject to constraints. And that's the vision they have. And it's a perfect society. And humans are very, very susceptible to visions of perfection. Walk down your local street and go and try to find somebody trying to sell you Scientology or any other mythical religion you wish to choose. A neoclassical economist belongs on the same corner without knowing it, which of course applies to the Scientologist as well.
Steve, okay, here's the thing. I'm what you would call a amateur armchair philosopher, right? Mm-hmm. So amongst, as the owner of a media company and a publishing firm, I do identify myself as a philosopher. It almost sounds like a far left plea or something, right? But here's the thing is that, what you're describing, I as a thinker, I gravitate towards Plato. And that's a weird thing to try and forthrightly come out with, because typically in academia, you would say this eventually kind of leads to ideology and all these kinds of things, right? This is the general sort of summary of the Platonic thinker, especially in isolation. Except for me, when I go back and I try and analyze something, or you try and be creative with something, I think you're right. There's a natural tendency for us to think towards what's the best, the best convergence of things, right?
Yeah.
So the fact is that, I mean, I like your perspective, because in, kind of a Platonic sort of emphasized conversation, it's coming from a mathematician. Oh, he'd be so proud.
I wouldn't call myself a mathematician. I call myself I would have been a mathematician and a physicist without 6 years of lousy maths and science teachers at school. But yeah, what I always understood the power of mathematics, and then I went into economics, courtesy of a great teacher in my second last year of high school. And that's what I continued on with and did at university, but with a strong mathematical foundation. So I studied maths at the same time as my economics degree. And that's what's made me such a strident critic of the mainstream, because often people, when they criticize the mainstream, they come up from another ideological angle. So you get Marxists criticizing neoclassical economics as a defense of capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. I say, no, it's not a defense, it's a mischaracterization. The things that they praise capitalism for are the last things on the planet capitalism actually demonstrates. and secondly, their mathematics is garbage. When you take a good look at it, every important proposition they put forward has been mathematically contradicted, often by one of their own number. But they then, and just the Marxists have done the same thing, so I'm not going to say neoclassicals are the only sinners in economics on that front, but they waffle to hang on to the core belief because the beliefs matter more than the logic. And this is a bit like Max Planck, because as Max Planck argued when he introduced quantum mechanics as a solution to the blackbody radiation problem, he could not convince his fellow Maxwellian physicists. He simply gave up. They could not get their minds around a different way of thinking about the universe. And so what he wrote was that science progresses. He actually is a very witty guy, as you probably know.
Yeah.
But science progresses one funeral at a time. And the lengthy way he said that is that a new idea doesn't succeed because the holders of the old ideas are convinced to abandon and adopt the new one. A new idea succeeds because the old retire and die, and new scientists take their place who are familiar with the new way of thinking. Now, what I've realized that doesn't happen in economics. Economics doesn't go through that phenomenon. Instead, despite huge empirical failures like the not only not seeing the 2007 financial crisis coming, but actually believing 2000 was going to be a great year, they hang on to their beliefs no matter what.
I want to pause you there because we can use that as kind of a pivot point to go into the financial crisis, which is really interesting. But I want to pause for a minute on Karl Marx, or Marxist. Yep. Well, let's call this Marxist. So I'm not kidding you. This came up just today. We have we call him the in-house philosopher. He's from the University of Texas, and he knew that we were getting together. We were going to have this conversation. And I'm not sure who it was, but there's a preeminent Marx economist, right? And so, Scott, he's the guy that, he's the philosopher from the University of Texas, said to me, he says, but Steve liked to debate him, right? Should we try and set that sort of conversation up? So I know it may feel like I'm ambushing you here, but this is the spirit of how I want to talk about things. Right?
Okay, yeah.
So I'm not going to put you in a corner to say, what do you want to do? I want to just have a discussion about what would be the benefit of this, right? So effectively, it really uncovers, that there's a bit of a goal here to the conversation that you and I are having. And we're not afraid to say what that goal is, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're writing so first of all, we're trying to figure out whether a conversation between a Marxist economist and yourself, would this have any sort of benefit for the message of your post-Keynesian message, as well as what you're working on with climate change? Would that be a good way to summarize what?
It depends. I mean, you might as well tell me who the Marxist is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
Just keep chatting while I do.
Okay. The reason I'm skeptical about this is that it's a bit like being the person who's dug up the body of Christ and you go to the Vatican and try to have an appointment with the Pope to say, I've got Jesus Christ's body in the back of my SUV. You're talking at cross purposes because according to the Pope, there can be no such thing. So therefore, you must be totally fallacious. And it just becomes a total waste of time. I'd be happy to have the experience of talking it over with one of them, but I've spoken to Marxists and neoclassicals, so I was blue in the face over these things. And believe me, I really understand how Max Planck felt.
Yeah. Okay.
So you found the name?
Yes, it was just right here. Okay, it's Harry Cleaver.
Harry Cleaver. Vaguely know the name. I was worried. I was checking to see if it was a guy called Alan Kleiman, Andrew Kleiman, pardon me, who's a jerk. And Andrew and I've had one stand-up fight, otherwise known as a plenary address, at a conference in Spain about 3 years ago. It could be worth to give it a try. Why not? Find out what happens.
Well, okay. Well, but I want to try and maybe see, because it depends how we're going to moderate it, right? It depends, is it effective to actually talk about something like climate change, right? Like make it themed about something as opposed to like an ideological conversation. Let's talk about,
You mean talk about climate change with the Marxist?
Yeah, for example, I don't know. I'm just throwing.
Well, you'd need to find a Marxist who made that a research focus. I don't know that there are any. David Harvey might be a possibility, but what has happened? I mean, what has happened with Marxism at one extreme? I'll give the Marxists one thing over the neoclassicals, and that is that Marxists are honest about not honest about their flaws, but honest about admitting they have flaws. In the sense that the big dilemma for Marx and Marxists was what's called the transformation problem, and that is they have a theory of value and a theory of price, and the theory of value argues that labour is the source of all profit. But the theory of price argues that profit is uniform across different industry sectors. Mm-hmm. And yet, if price is uniform, you have different ratios of labour to capital in every industry sector. How do you manage to get uniform prices out of that? Now, it's a mathematical conundrum Marx thought he solved by an example he gave in what became the third volume of Capital. But it wasn't a proper solution. It was one of these curious set of arithmetic numbers which appeared with like you managed to make three lines intersect at one point, but only at that one point. And if you moved away, you needed a general theory that covered the entire number plane, and Marx didn't provide it. And Marxists, in fact, put it this way, I did my master's thesis on Marx. Mm. My master's thesis was looking at the Marx's philosophy, which is Hegelian philosophy, and how that affected his theory of value. And when I was in
can I ask a question as a layman philosopher?
Yeah, sure.
It's a really important, it's like a learning moment, right? So this is maybe what I'll do, because I love how you lecture. I might raise my hand and you can see me in the audience. Yes, Daniel.
Okay.
I mean, we can
it, right? Okay, why not? Yeah.
Okay, so this Hegelian thing, would I be correct in characterizing that it's that subject-object, the dialectic conversation, like pitting two things off of each other, right?
Yeah, you are. But what is your framework for doing that? If you said subject-object, which is one way to talk about like base and superstructure and so on. Mm-hmm. But there's a particular line of jargon that people use, which they think is Marx's dialectic, which is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's one of those things that make it very hard to pronounce. You feel like I'm a little loopy. You always get to the third one, you can't. Synthesis, I always get it wrong. And I knew people said that was Marx's philosophy, and I read all of Marx, everything he wrote in economics. I totaled them up one day. The books came to just below the height of a tennis net. And
quick question, teacher.
Yeah.
So the thing is, as you're reading all of this, how do you, like, I find when I read something from Marx, I can only take so much of it and I come back out, right? Because it somehow like obscures my ability to think, or to, like, I lose my track, right? So I have kind of like some go-to authors that I'll kind of go back to. We call it.
No, first time I read Marx in the original in Capital Volume 1. And that was back in 1973-74, which is summer in Australia. And with a whole bunch of other lefties, we wasted our summer in a corner of what's called the main quadrangle at Sydney University, in one of the philosophy department rooms, collectively reading Marx and methodically going through chapter to chapter, chapter 1, blah, 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 blah. And that's always been my approach. I read something methodically. So I start with the original argument, and I just read it, and I'm trying to make sense of it as I go. And I found what I thought was a brilliant exposition by Marx into where surplus came from, using the concepts of use value and exchange value. I thought it was superb. But when I applied it to labour, it reached the result that labour produces a surplus, which is Marx's point. But I applied it to capital, machinery, and I got exactly the same answer. Machinery produces a surplus. Now, that was not what Marxists believed. It's not what Marx said except twice in his own writings. So what I find is people, I tend to read someone and say, I want to understand what you think. And I think that's different. I want to know what you think. And yet I think when my own experience with these other lefties reading Marx, they were reading it like they were reading the Bible.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. When I gave up Catholicism, I became an agnostic, not a Buddhist, Rastafarian or anything else. Some of the Rastafarian stuff is okay, but I don't have a belief system in that sense, and so I just look for the logic. And Marx logically explained why labour was not the only source of value, in my opinion, in chapter 6 and 7 of Capital, and then obfuscated it from that point forward. So when I came to read Marx and say, okay, where did he get this insight? Where did it go wrong? What I did in my master's was I literally read everything Marx wrote on economics in chronological order, starting with the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. So I read from that first page of that to the last page of the Capital Volume 3 in chronological order.
Wow. That's impressive. We'll get into. I mean, what would you think that the Marxist is going to say? Like, what are the biggest bones they pick with you? Like,
it's all over me saying that labour is not the only source of value. That's the bone, and it's also. I mean, the bone will also come over whether they think the philosophy that I focus on is important or not. Like, for example, I taught a course in Marxist economics. Maybe in a history of economic thought course with a guy. He's a friend of sorts, a bit difficult. He's a rather bitchy personality. But anyway, I'll mention his name, Peter Chrysler at New South Wales University. And Peter and I were teaching this course together when he was already a lecturer and quite well established, and I was doing my master's. I just turned up on the scene. And as we're explaining Marx to the students, Peter says, you shouldn't read the first 7 chapters of Capital. It'll just confuse you. Start with chapter 8 or chapter 9. And I didn't say anything. I was a bit subservient in those days, well, because I just turned up. I thought that's ridiculous advice. The philosophical foundation of Marx's approach to economics is in the first 7 chapters, particularly chapter 6 and chapter 7 from memory. So if you don't read that, you're just going to say, oh, Marx has a labour theory of value, without knowing how he derived the labour theory of value. But in Marx's own mind, his greatest achievement was deriving the labour theory of value from his own philosophy. Now, because I say that, and then I show that, in fact, it contradicts the labour theory of value, it gives a solid foundation to a surplus theory of value, to a physical as opposed to utility theory of value, but it undermines the labour theory of value. Now, when I say that, of course, Marxists, it's a bit like I'm saying Jesus Christ as a Buddhist.
I totally
they get angry.
Yeah, totally. Now let me see. Let's try and just empathize this from the the other way around. Okay.
Yeah.
And it would be more of a noble cause if you could react in a way that your peers are not reacting, right? So, no, but seriously,
Okay.
let me kind of frame this.
Yeah, I know what you meant. Yeah.
If I had compelling evidence, mathematical evidence that showed a contradiction, because that's what you're talking about. It's like reading a story and realizing, well, why does this narrative not go together? Well, there's a logical inconsistency there.
Yeah.
Right? So I'd make the assertion here that there is just such a bias that supersedes their identity. Now, this is
that's a good point. Yeah.
It might even offend somebody to think that. I think it'd be crippling intellectually for me if I knew every foundation that I had projected and worked on as a PhD. This is the pinnacle of society when you go and get a PhD, right? This is right. Somehow our matriarchy doesn't value intellect as much as it does celebrityism, right? I mean, that's the weird world that we live in, right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
But in terms of academic, it's the pinnacle. That's getting your PhD is a major step to say you have nailed a particular area, and it becomes part of your self-image after that.
Yeah, and so something so entrenched in it's got opposing forces right from the beginning, right? It is in opposition. It's like it's like the magnet. It just in the opposite poles. They just can't come together. You almost realize
that's a very good analogy, and that what tends to happen because. Most people, I think it pretty helps the fact that, having been a Catholic and then rejecting the Catholic religion during the days of the Vietnam War. I remember having a conversation with we were fighting. We had actually had a dispute at Sydney University over the teaching of feminist philosophy. And I was one of the leading personalities fighting in favor of the course being taught. And I was doing arts and law as my undergraduate was a degree, combined arts law degree. And one of the other main people on the other side against the feminist philosophy was another member of the arts law group, very nice guy, who was quite religious. And some years later, we finally sat down and had this, intense heart-to-heart about our vision of the universe and so on. I remember him saying at one point, "I can't imagine a universe without a God, without a God." And I looked at him and said, "That's interesting. I can't imagine a universe with one." Now, when you start from those perspectives, there's absolutely no way you can agree on the nature of the universe. And that is, I think, very human.
Right. Okay, I want to do a little pause intersection, and I want you to maybe write this person's name down.
Okay. Yep.
It's Yeonmi Park.
Again?
She's from North Korea, and Google search a video from Jordan Peterson. It's season 4, episode 26, and the show's called Tyranny, Slavery, and Columbia U. Now, that's kind of your homework assignment for next week.
Hang on a second. What's give me the spelling of his last name is Park. That's easy. What's the first two? What's the given names?
It's Yeonmi, so it's Yeonmi.
Yeonmi Park. Okay. With Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
I've got to watch a Jordan Peterson video, have I?
I know. It's like, he cries a lot, right? You know that.
I'll survive. Okay. Yeah.
Poor guy, can't even get through an interview without crying. It's like, can you imagine, okay, what kind of state of mind would I have to get you into to be, okay, we'll put a little bit of a fun spin on it. And I know you're up for this, because I was reading your book and I remember the footnote, the one you were talking about, this parody about the econs. It was great.
Oh, the Life Among the Econ. Yeah.
I imagine, like, in this business, like, you set up for an interview, you like read my stuff, and someone glosses over the headlines, and okay, yeah, I get Steve. I know how to ask these kind of questions, right? But I'm not like that, man. I'm reading your book. I'm looking at the footnotes. I'm like, the guy's funny. He puts these little jokes in and irony here and there. I think it's like, man, you're going to make a new form of, but it's going to be hard to study in the future. 400 years in the future, they're not going to. Maybe we don't even have comedy anymore.
I think that's all we've got left.
Yeah, well, so they won't know the subtle differences in kind of the the cultural thing, right? At least here's in a defense of perfectionism, is that you can always look back and say, well, generally speaking, this is the way that culture was. And the reason why I keep going back to the Greeks, which maybe it is a fundamental bias towards perfection, but the issue is that maybe that just describes what we're thinking. So, on the perimeter, we should be able to kind of check that against, like you say, mathematics, empirical information. And if we turn around and look at the virtual tree behind us, or the post, it does say, it's the partial theme of the show is, how do we leverage, larger and larger, like, data structures and help us, become better human beings, right? So it's a little bit of a call to liberty for, the integration of technology into humanity is essentially a part of that claim.
That's a good claim to have. We'll see how it goes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
so I've got a Yeonmi Park on Jordan Peterson. Okay.
Yeah, for next week, that's what we'll talk about. I don't do that a lot, actually. You won't find me come with such a strong recommendation, but just to give it a bit of a context, someone who was as imprintable as George Orwell, this is what she, I think, possibly could be for this generation. I mean, and Steve, if you understand that is not an easy claim to make.
That's Yeonmi Park as George Orwell, or Jordan Peterson as George Orwell?
No, this young girl is, I think.
Yeonmi Park. Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
I'll have a
but in terms of being able to remember who she is, it would be hard to say in our current generation that. And I was gonna, it's kind of funny. I was gonna use Isaac Newton as the example, but he's kind of not the example, because he was pretty close to the power structures of intellect. In Britain. And so they kind of knew he was going to be I mean, they buried him in the abbey, right? So
yeah, he started out with a much more common beginning than that, but yeah, he was a commoner, but he ended up at the being exalted, and rightly so.
Yeah.
After he lost his shirt in the South Sea bubble, but still.
Yeah. So I mean, there's all sorts of stories of how the world treated some of our intellectual heroes, and some of them had an easy path, and other ones had kind of a tortuous path. And Steve, you might kind of maybe you blush in a way intellectually when I say this, but what project you're working on and the paper that you want to submit to the version of the Royal Society is like I was imagining that you're my uncle, and I sat you down and we went out for for a beer or something, and I'm like, hey, Uncle Steve, like, this is a big deal, man. Like, this is like,
I mean,
you're elevating to the level of these people, right? So
yeah, I mean, my objective is to destroy neoclassical economics before it destroys capitalism.
Right on, bringing it back to the point. Thank you for that. But it's well, what I am going to test you with throughout this series is I want to test abstractions, right? I think there's room for storytelling, there's room for imagination, but they're not antithetical with the structure you're putting forth, right?
Yep. Indeed.
And so I want listeners to understand and see a dimension to Steve that says, hey, you know what? When I show up for work as an economist, I can put that hat on, and then the counterfactual of talking about beauty or aesthetics or the use of imagination, we can, Steve can also do that. And he proved it earlier in this show where he was talking about a fundamental issue with Marxism, right? About that sort of thing. So I don't know. I really think you're the man to be able to, ask some kind of, complicated sort of questions, a few what if scenarios.
Yep. Happy to do it. Okay. I found myself in a weird situation. I never thought I'd be sitting in this sort of chair making those sorts of comments. I thought I'd be a foot soldier rather than a general, but I've ended up being a general, so I have to live with it.
You're decisive, man. I tell you, like, I like the profanity drops every once in a while. The way you introduce people is like, well, I really shouldn't. Oh, their name is this. It's classy, right? It's classy and bold. It's more like, it's like the proper, like, British version of Nassim Taleb, right? Like, without the
yeah. Well, Taleb has got a great capacity to be rude, that's for sure.
And then you see, like, the people that kind of follow him, like Dad Sad, they try and, like, they mimic it and say, oh yes, people are like, you treat them like this and you gain success, like, and I just shake my head.
No necessity to be an asshole to be a good intellect.
No, but
sometimes it helps if you get less disturbances, but it's not a necessity.
I know that. We've rationalized that, but imagine the whole system kind of taking over, and all of our friends, all of society were like, oh yes, we're worthless, kind of thing. Could you imagine us watching that? But fortunately, we don't have a society like that. We question that.
To some extent. I think we've lost a lot of that in the last 20 or 30 years, but it's... that's one thing. I'm very lucky to be raised in the 50s and 60s and experience my adult, teenage and adult life in the 70s. It's a lot freer world back then than it is now. So I feel for students these days and young people in general for what they experience. We had some pretty shitty things as well. Being conscripted to go and fight in Vietnam wasn't fun. So I'm not saying that the children of the baby boomers had it all great, or the baby boomers themselves when they were adults. But it's certainly they had more freedom than the kids have these days.
Well, let's talk about the because I'll come at it from two directions. I'm father of a couple of teenage boys, and also I don't know. It seems like, here's my intuition. I think they've got plenty of freedom. Now, I haven't really thought about it, right? I think they have plenty of freedom. I think they stay closer to the nest, right? I think there's, my kids very innocently don't, when I was a kid, I was gone all day and the parents didn't know. And then it was even worse than that, it went up the generation sort of thing. So it's like our protection sort of thing is coming in, this idea of helicopter parents. I get that. That feels intuitively like a description, that
I'm thinking more about the fact that when I went through university, you felt like you could do whatever you liked at university, you'd still get a job.
Oh.
And therefore, questioning authority, breaching social norms wasn't something you worried about is going to jeopardize your physical survival in the future. I don't think kids have got that anymore these days.
Yeah. And we should have a mechanism for that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we end up having a constrained minds coming out of it.
Well, and so here's the thing. So let's talk about the universities from a meta standpoint, because that's a perfect entry point to categorize what the institution is and what it represents, right? So we talked earlier about the PhD being at that pinnacle, right? And so what is the way to get the information down to the lowest level of thinkers, right? What is the most effective way to do that? And you might think it's something related to this, where the innovation's going to happen on a medium that, translates like the internet does, right? Like, makes sense.
And that's a fabulous resource that didn't exist, of course, in my day as a young student. So, in that sense, access to information and also misinformation, of course, is far broader now than it was ever.
Right.
Which one is winning? I'm afraid they're giving misinformation the upper hand.
Well, the issue is that I want to have an interesting conversation on its strategy, or it's actually the basis of rhetoric, and I think it's probabilistic.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so we introduce a kind of a probability scale, or and we say something like what we're describing is more of the ideal, but through like a contaminated sort of ideological system, we can see ourselves living in a false version of, a description of the universe. We can see that. You're describing even one like
Plato's cave. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Well, and I think there's always a kind of a series of Plato's caves emerging in various different areas, to various different degrees, and they radiate out like in the ether, so it's an imaginary sort of thing, right? But they sort of radiate out, and they have different cultural effects. The other system that you were referring to in your book is the paradigm shift, which is kind of the concept where society steps back and looks and kind of reorientates itself a little bit.
Yeah, I mean that was Max Planck's experience. I think is incredibly important in seeing how paradigm shifts actually happen. And whether they do, and the big thing for economics is we haven't had one since 1870, and we had a nascent one with Keynes, and that got slaughtered. So economics is still thinking as it was in its armchair in 1870, with more elaborate and wrong mathematics surrounding the armchair. But that's where we are now. So to change that paradigm, when it's become how the whole world thinks about how the economy works. Getting that myth out of people's minds and giving them a realistic framework is extremely hard. So, that's why I'm willing to give any system a try that might make that work.
Wow. Okay. So here's a big question for you. It's and just as a matter of practicality, let's say, and I'm on your side. I really think you're an incredible thinker, and I'm here to support in any way I can. I want to let you know that.
Thank you.
The way I think of it is, let's imagine that nothing changed for our entire lifetime. So we kind of go to the grave with the system the way it is right now today. We wouldn't be the first thinkers in posterity to have that pulled from the grave in maybe 3 or 4 generations. Someone picks up the books by Keynes and says, "Hey, shit, right?" I mean, so imagine we brought up Marx as an example. Imagine we could sit down with the man and say, "Hey, look, look at the situation, and present the evidence to him." Do you think it would be convincing for him? I think it would be.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, I know Marx at one point worked out a contradiction of his preferred way of thinking. He when this use value, exchange value logic, which we'll talk about at some point in our conversations, undermined the labour theory of value, and he realised it, and he resiled from it. He rapidly tried to find a way to make his new way of thinking consistent with his old way of thinking. Now, I think if we could bring Marx to now and say, this is the consequence of you doing that, Karl, what do you think? I mean, he'd probably go and kill himself all over again. looking at the travesties that came out of that. And so I have enough respect for him as a human being to say I think he probably would say, holy shit, I wish I hadn't done that. But when confronted within his own life, he didn't make that change.
Yeah, he didn't. He couldn't see the projections, and no one has a crystal ball. I do think about that, and that idea of consequence, Steve. I want to focus on for a minute because we've just jumped, in terms of, say like a Marxist claim or like a critique. As soon as you jump into that category, we actually change completely. In I guess what our fundamental claim is here with Marx, right? So, what is the argument with Marx? What is the main contention? What is the big sticking point that you think that Marx would or wouldn't have if he was here today?
Well, I mean, he tried to distinguish himself from all the other intellectual revolutionaries of his time by calling himself a scientific socialist. And you had plenty of people who were arguing for socialism in opposition to what capitalism was at the time. And most people don't properly think what was capitalism like for Karl Marx in 1848 or thereabouts, when he ended up going across the UK. I think it was 1848 across the UK. My picture for England in the 1840s and 50s is Calcutta in the 1970s. Okay? Yeah. With for example, one reason why I can say that, Karl and Jenny Marx moved out of Chelsea because of a cholera outbreak. So we're looking at incredibly tough living conditions, shithouse pay, poverty everywhere, ostentatious displays of wealth at the same time as this huge poverty, and a dismissive ruling class, because one thing England has managed to hang on to is an us and them mentality from the elite to the majority. So in that world, it was a very, very tough world. And if you had any sense of human decency, then you would be thinking there must be a better way to design society than this. So even like companies like Colgate, for example, came out of somebody who was a proto-socialist, who was trying to design a society which was fair and gave a decent standard of living to everybody, regardless of their social class, obviously with gradations of pay, but that was Colgate's ambition. And there were many, many idealistic manufacturing, cultural socialists. And what Marx said, well, he was different to all of those because he was a scientific socialist. He was going to prove that socialism had to come about. Now, and that's what led to the labour theory of value becoming so important. That's what led to the declining rate of profit being such an important concept for Marx. And he really did think that socialism was inevitable. Now, when you see if you brought him forward from, when did he die? I've forgotten the actual date of his death, in the 1880s, I think. Fast forward him to the 1980s and watch the fall of the Berlin Wall. Fast forward him to today, I think he'd be horrified by what happened. And he wouldn't make anywhere near as many excuses for the state of actual existing socialism as the socialists today do. Yeah. No, that was, I was trying to get around to it earlier, but the idea of consequences. So if I have a conversation with a Marxist, one of the things that I'm going to bring up, and I think that people can't get away from we're talking about a debate, right? Just how two sides. And so the consequence of the body counts, right? Now, part of what I know as a philosopher is I don't know where that connection is actually deeply rooted, whether the evil and body counts is actually related to the Marxist thinking, right? Now, I just don't. You mean the body count of the gulags and things like that? Exactly, because here's the thing, and there's somebody like Jordan Peterson who's got a pretty big voice in the media, at least as an intellectual thinker. Regardless of if you have a bone to pick with him or not, it doesn't matter. He is somebody that, from an intellectual sort of tradition, people are looking towards somebody in that elite, and he's affecting change. Okay, good, bad, indifferent,
whatever he's trying to focus on, and we can be sympathetic of that. That's also the risk that Steve is now putting himself into, right? This is what you're doing.
Oh, yeah.
With popularity comes, all the attention you might get. Well, you are getting.
Yeah.
I mean, who's kidding me, right? What an interview on CNBC, hey?
That was extremely good. I was very pleased. That was actually one of my Patreon supporters, Paul Gambles, who is very well named. He ended up running a finance company in Bangkok for the last 30 years. One of my close friends over here, and in general. And Paul, he's such a lovely, avuncular guy. And of course, he works with people in finance all the time in the media. He suggested that interview, and they did a brilliant job. I was very pleased. That's the first time I had a chance to really put my critique of neoclassical economics of climate change forward to a public audience. It was fantastic.
Well, we certainly are going to do a lot of that in this particular series. We're approaching the top of the hour. This is probably pretty much where we'll come up to like a bit of a conclusion.
Yep.
We're trying to keep this to about an hour. And we're going to do it every week, see where it goes. I hope to be, talking about a little bit of Marx and a whole lot of climate change. Some fantasy make-believe stuff may come up. And, Steve's going to be putting me back in my place. So, we're going to have some fun with this, and we're going to show a fun side between both of us, and just see where it goes. So thank you.
Sounds good. Okay. Thanks, Daniel.
You bet. Bye.